Most of us are familiar with natural selection and the work of Charles Darwin. We'll talk about that, but I'm going to talk about two other forms of selection, both artificial and sexual selection in this video. When you're trying to use the word selection, sometimes students are confused, and so the best analogy I can come up with is thinking back to your days playing kickball or playing baseball when you were young, and they'd have everybody line up, and then the two captains would get to choose who they want on their team, and hopefully you didn't get picked last. I hope they don't do this in elementary anymore, but that's selection. Selection is when someone is choosing or something is choosing who is the strongest, the fastest, and then those that aren't chosen. In kickball, you just get chosen last, but in natural selection or in artificial selection, that means you don't get to pass your genes on to the next generation. This guy right here, Norman Borlaug, is somebody who most of you don't know, but he's known as the father of the Green Revolution. In other words, we were under duress on our planet. We were running out of food. We weren't able to produce enough food to feed everyone, and so this started in the 30s, 40s, 50s on. And so basically Norman Borlaug was a farmer, and what he did is produce a number of different traits of wheat, and he started by working in Mexico. And so he produced wheat. First of all, he was able to produce wheat two times a season. He produced wheat that had bigger grains on the top by doing artificial selection. He also, when they grew too tall, they'd fall over, and so then he would hybridize them with a shorter kind of a mutant that had short stalks, and so they could have a lot of seeds on that. And so as a result of that, we were able to increase wheat yields on the planet. So look at this. By the work of Norman Borlaug and others, we took production of wheat on our planet, 1950, up to in 1990 and up to 2000, it's increased, many-fold. And that's through artificial selection, selecting the traits that we want. And so when humans are making that choice based on variation, we call that artificial selection. Ecological selection is a form of natural selection where nature makes the choice. And this was first described by Darwin along with sexual selection. And basically we could break it down into three things that can happen to a bell-shaped curve. The first of those is going to be called directional selection. So imagine we have this variation. So we're going to have one end and one end. So we've got extremes, but most of the averages are going to be in the middle. And so let's say change takes place in the ecology. Change takes place in the ecosystem, how organisms are going to be selected for or against. And so an example could be these, which are the glacier lilies. Glacier lilies come up right after the snow leaves. And so basically they'll start to come out right when the snow melts, and then they're going to do pollination and then makes the next generation. But basically what's going on right now is that the climate is getting warmer and warmer and warmer. And so what's happening? Well, as it gets warmer and warmer and warmer, the glacier lilies that come out right here aren't going to do very well. But the glacier lilies that happen to come out a little bit earlier are going to do better. And so we're going to see directional selection. In other words, we're going to see this curve move in one direction. And so how does that work? Basically, it works by, if you're a glacier lily that now comes out much later, you're going to die because it's going to be way too hot at that point. And so we get a push in this direction. That's directional selection. We also can have stabilizing selection. A great example of that, if we think of this red line as before, why do most babies weigh around 7 pounds? Well, if you were to be born and weigh like 1 pound back in the day, you died. You were premature and you didn't survive. If you were to be an 18-pound baby and you were to be born right here, you're going to get stuck in your mom, and your genes are going to die, and your mom's genes are going to die, and we're not going to pass that on to the next generation. And so basically what we have is we're having selection. We're killing on either side of this bell-shaped curve, and so that's going to squeeze the bell-shaped curve together. And then the last thing that can happen is, if we think of this red being the bell-shaped curve, maybe the ones in the middle aren't doing that well, but the ones on the extremes are doing well. What's an example of that? Well, remember those first finches on Galapagos arrived there, and they started filling different niches. They started eating different foods. And so let's say one feeds on a small seed, one feeds on a big seed. Basically, we get disruptive or diversifying selection. Now, what can eventually happen is that can split into two species. And so basically, this is all natural selection. The organisms that are selected, the organisms that survive, pass their genes on to the next generation.